I think, like many people, I have been getting increasingly frustrated with the use of the terms left and right in contemporary politics. And in this video, I want to present an alternative set of concepts for classifying political attitudes. So this one-dimensional classification of political opinions into left-wing versus right-wing doesn't really capture the things that divide people today. It's no longer fit for purpose. And it's not just that, it's also the way the terms have been weaponized so that people with quite moderate conservative beliefs, such as favouring small government and family values, are labelled as right-wing or even far-right, as if they are aligned with the Nazis. And I think this comes down to the struggle between globalism and nationalism, which is the biggest issue on today's political agenda. You see, on the one hand, we have what the anthropologist Jonathan Friedman calls global elites, who believe that the world is so connected now that a global government is necessary and inevitable to deal with the flows of commerce, people and pollution that cut across national borders, creating problems that need to be managed at the global level, and who also perhaps see national borders as obstacles to their own accumulation of wealth and power. And on the other hand, you have the nationalists, people who reject globalism, who value local identities and local ways of life, and who as part of that are opposed to population flows that overwhelm society's natural capacity to adapt, leading to obvious and rapid cultural change. And if you veer away from globalism and towards nationalism, you will be labelled far right. And of course the word Nazi comes from the German National, implying nationalistic beliefs. But people who are sceptical of contemporary progressive agendas are not necessarily close to the Nazis on the political spectrum. And so in the new political typology or new vocabulary I'm going to suggest, there will be 4 dimensions rather than 1, allowing us to make this kind of distinction. Now, this new political vocabulary is also about what I will call political styles, where I emphasise the word style as opposed to the content of political beliefs. So you might have a Christian fundamentalist believing in the literal truth of the Bible, and an Islamic fundamentalist believing in the literal truth of the Quran. The detailed content of their beliefs can be different, such as whether Jesus was the Son of God or just a prophet. But the style is the same, dogmatic, implacable, and appealing to textual authority. It's the same as how St. Paul went from a fanatical persecutor of Christians to a fanatical promoter of the Christian message. The content of his thought changed 180 degrees, but the style of his thought remained the same, namely fanatical and proactively pushing his agenda. And in this typology, I am focusing not on content, which depends on the time and place, but on style. So fundamentalism is fundamentalism, whether it's Christian fundamentalism or Islamic fundamentalism. The terms left-wing and right-wing come from the time of the French Revolution, when royalists sat on the right side of the debating chamber and revolutionaries sat on the left side. So right has come to be associated with being conservative, i.e. committed to stabilisation of the existing order of society, or looking back to the past, while left has come to be associated with being progressive, i.e. committed to changing and reforming the social order, or looking forward to the future. Now, for a healthy society, you need both. It's no good being stagnant and completely stuck in the traditional way of doing things, refusing to consider improvements. But on the other hand, it could be disastrous to change society willy-nilly and tear up things that are working well. You need to conserve what's worth conserving and make progress where progress is possible. Traditional institutions such as the monarchy or the nuclear family were not put in place out of stupidity or out of sheer nastiness. They have been shaped by experience, and they have stood the test of time because they meet human needs. But these institutions aren't perfect. They don't suit everyone, and their usefulness may have deteriorated because of other changes in the social context, such as improving transport and communications. The challenge is to identify what's worth holding on to and what can be changed without producing unintended consequences that end up making things worse. This is the analogy of Chesterton's fence. The writer G.K. Chesterton imagines some walkers in the countryside coming across a fence that blocks their way. Their instinct might be to tear it down, but that could be dangerous if they don't know what the fence is for. It might be stopping a bull from getting out of the field, for example. Chesterton says, don't tear down fences until you understand why they are there. But if you do understand and you're happy with it, then go right ahead. Social institutions are like fences in the way of progress. We shouldn't hang on to them mindlessly, but neither should we change them unless we understand why they exist. And deciding which is which, what should be preserved and what can be changed, is not an easy task, and many heads are better than one. And that is why we need there to be a debate between conservatives and progressives. Now, much of what I have just said is itself political. There are shades of political opinion which don't agree that debate is necessary or desirable. And if we're going to have a new political typology, we do need to include that as one of the possibilities. So I have already partly shown you where I sit in the typology. Anyway, politics is not just about debating the options so we can pick the best one. The reason we have politics is because people have different interests, by which I mean that what is in this person's interest is not in that person's interest, or what is good for person A is not good for person B. So it's not just a question of whether change is good or not good. It's a question of whether change is good for me, and whether it's good for you, and whether it's good for them. And we might disagree about that. So that's why we have politics, a power struggle to see whose point of view wins out. Now, that power struggle might be decided with guns. Mao Zedong said power comes out of the barrel of a gun. Or it might be decided with voting and elections. But politics is a struggle over interests. So in a nutshell, people's political opinions are likely to reflect their interests, what's good for them. For example, it's often said that young people are idealistic because they are drawn to socialistic causes, meaning they favour the redistribution of power and wealth in society. They want a fairer, more equal world. But this is not because young people are more caring. It's because when they are just starting out in life, they don't have much wealth and power. They haven't had time to build up wealth and power. So we can say the amount of wealth and power they possess is below average. And this means that if there is a redistribution of wealth and power, the effect will be for their own wealth and power to increase. And so their attitude to redistribution tends to be for. Creating a more equal society seems to be a way to shift power and wealth in their direction. But as people grow older, they begin to acquire assets and social status through their own hard work. The amount of wealth and power they possess is now above average, and this means that a redistribution of wealth and power will cause their own wealth and power to decrease. So their attitude to redistribution tends to be against. So it's not that young people are more caring and old people are more selfish. At each age, people favour the politics that is most compatible with their own self-interest. If you're young and poor, you like redistribution because you will be a net beneficiary. When you're old and rich, you don't like it because you'll be a net loser. Now, we need to distinguish political opinions from both psychological attributes and cultural values. So people's beliefs and behaviour are shaped not just by their politics, but also by their personalities and by their cultural backgrounds. And the big difference between politics versus culture and personality is that people's politics can change, whereas personality is something that you are largely born with, and culture is something that is imprinted on you in childhood. Neither personality nor culture changes very much, at least under normal circumstances. Your character is just what it is, and it's very difficult for you to alter. And your culture is something you take for granted, like your language or the air that you breathe. It seems to be the natural way of thinking about the world and of getting along with other people. I won't say that personality and culture don't change at all, but they don't change much for most people. But your politics can change a lot. As we've seen, politics is about interests, and as your interests change, your politics can change. You can go from voting for one party to voting for their opposite, either as you grow older, say, or as your social situation changes, or just after you've seen what a mess the first party has made of things. So I want to be clear that in this typology I am talking specifically about politics and not about personality or culture. But that said, politics is not simply a rational calculation of self-interest. There can also be social contagion. Politics has fashions and moods, meaning that society's values and attitudes can swing from one side to another, and so different political parties come and go. This shifting of moods has something to do with Aristotle's principle that no way of organising society is perfect, and so people keep switching from one system to another. If the party of one side has been in power for long enough, people get to understand the problems of that side, and they forget the drawbacks of the other side. So their attitudes and loyalties shift, and this shift is amplified by their friends and neighbours, and by the media, and by cultural products like films and books. And so the whole society experiences a switch of mood. So let's turn to the typology. I've taken my inspiration from the Myers-Briggs classification of personality types, which is nicely summarised by Jake Beach on Wikipedia like this. The Myers-Briggs classification was developed by a mother-daughter team in the first half of the 20th century and was partly inspired by the ideas of Carl Jung. It involves 4 dimensions of personality, each of which can take on 2 values, giving a total of 16 possible combinations, or 16 personality types in all. 4 dimensions seems a good choice because it has enough flexibility to capture the important differences without getting too complicated. In my case, I wrote down various political contrasts and grouped them into similar themes, and it turned out that a division into 4 dimensions seemed to work. So here are the 4 dimensions. The first dimension is individualist collectivist. The second dimension is private public. The third dimension is intrinsic extrinsic. The fourth dimension is ambiguous certain. And now I will explain each one in turn. The individualist collectivist dimension is about how we treat and react to other people. Individualists believe that people should be treated as individuals based on their personal characteristics and behaviours. Collectivists believe that people should be treated as members of groups, and they expect people to have stereotyped behaviours and opinions that are characteristic of their group. Individualists believe that individual rights should not be violated. Collectivists believe that group norms should not be violated. Individualists think and act independently. Collectivists are conformists in their thinking, and that is not necessarily conformism to traditional thinking, but is often conformism to new or at least repackaged ideologies. So collectivism is characteristic of communist movements and countries. These often have the word peoples in their title, like the People's Republic of China and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Or there is the related term the Popular Front for this or that. The use of peoples or popular implies that the people all have a common interest and all think in the same way, denying the possibility that they are in fact individuals with different goals, different ambitions, and different visions for society. Collectivist politics may seem particularly uncomfortable to people with individualist attitudes because they involve a form of gaslighting. Collectivists claim to be speaking on behalf of the people. They say, we represent you. And if people feel, but I don't agree with you, they are being gaslighted. Individualists may think, these collectivists claim to be acting for the people, and I am one of the people, and yet I don't like what they're doing and don't feel it is helpful to me. So am I the one who is crazy? And it's not just communists. Fascists and Nazis also have the collectivist style, i.e. emphasising the unity of their own group and treating others not as individuals but as members of a particular group, perhaps persecuting them just because they belong to that group. Now it may be said, hang on, fascists are right-wing and communists are left-wing, so they are completely different. Well, no. On this aspect of political style, they are the same. This is why I say the left-right terminology is not fit for purpose. The Nazis described themselves as socialists. They were National Socialists. In fact, they were the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This represents a collectivist version of nationalism that involves treating the nation as a single entity with a common purpose, not as a set of individuals. Similarly, the Scottish National Party is collectivist insofar as it presents all Scots as having a single shared interest against the common enemy of English domination of the United Kingdom. So yes, although there may be policy differences between fascists and communists, the style is the same. It didn't really matter whether you were deprived of your property and transported to a labour camp for being a kulak, a rich peasant, as under Stalin's communism, or for being Jewish, as under Hitler's fascism. At the end of the day, your treatment was equally unjust and painful. And the actor Lawrence Fox gave an example of individualist attitudes when he was asked who he backed in the Tory leadership election that followed the resignation of Boris Johnson. And he said, it's got to be Kemi Badenoch. Now, Lawrence Fox has come out against wokeness and would be considered right-wing and anti-feminist. So here was a far-right white man backing a black woman. And why? Because he liked her ideas, he liked what she said. Her group identity was not important. He saw Kemi Badenoch as an individual and judged her as an individual. The private-public dimension is about whether people's political goals focus on their private affairs, their job, their family, their personal way of life, or whether they focus on public affairs, reforming social institutions and improving the lives of others. People with the private approach are only concerned about being good citizens, getting along with their neighbours and helping those around them, presumably thinking that if everyone does the same, the society in general will be a nice place to live. People with the public approach are concerned about changing society directly, not through their own behaviour and relationships, but by affecting the behaviour of everyone in general. Private-oriented people want to affect only their own lives. Public-oriented people want to change the world. Private-oriented people have modest and realistic goals, and they have practical plans to get there. Public-oriented people have grandiose and possibly unachievable goals, and their plans tend to be based on sweeping theories. So here let's introduce the term Jellybyism, which we can stick on the public side of this political dimension. Mrs. Jellyby is a character in Charles Dickens's Bleak House, and Mrs. Jellyby is always organising schemes to help children in Africa while failing to care for her own children who are dirty and neglected. This is a caricature of the public-oriented political type, people who overlook basic decency and responsibility because they are aiming at much higher things. Their sense of righteousness comes from solving the problems of the world, not solving the petty and mundane issues of everyday life. The syndrome was described by Wilfred Beckerman, an Oxford University economics professor, at a conference in the 1980s. He said that in his experience, those students who are most passionately concerned with the problems of people living 3,000 miles away in space or 500 years away in time, i.e. helping the starving of Africa or saving the planet for future generations, are usually those who wouldn't go out of their way to help a blind person cross the road or deal with their own problems of producing an essay for me next week. So yes, such students have very grand and noble goals, which are at the same time completely unrealistic, while their tangible contribution to making the world a better place is difficult to discern. Now, for a more positive spin on the public-oriented political attitude, we can turn to the work of Arthur Schlesinger Jr., which is where I got the terms public and private from. He spoke of an oscillation between public purpose and private interest phases in American history. For example, the 1960s was a public purpose era that saw great gains in civil rights, while the Reagan years were a private interest phase that emphasised the values of Wall Street. So public purpose phases are about reform, inclusion, raising the fortunes of the disadvantaged, and are about the wrongs of the many, while private interest phases are about hands-off government, deregulation, the primacy of the market, and the rights of the few. Though I'm not sure I really agree that it's the rights of the few, rather than in fact the rights of the many. But anyway, it's the same basic distinction. Public is about grappling with huge problems at the level of the whole society, while private is about personal lifestyles and concerns. The intrinsic-extrinsic dimension is about who you think is responsible for getting you to achieve your wishes. People with the intrinsic attitude locate that responsibility in themselves, while people with the extrinsic attitude assign that responsibility to others. So intrinsic type people are self-confident and believe in their capacity to succeed and prosper in life. They are happy with their situation and their relationships with others. And even if they have unfulfilled goals, they see those goals as being achievable through their own efforts. Extrinsic type people believe that the world is against them, that it denies them the chance to achieve what others achieve, and that they will be unable to attain their goals by their own efforts. Intrinsic people believe that if they are going to achieve their goals, then they must do certain things, whereas extrinsic people believe that the only way for them to achieve their goals is if other people change what they are doing. So extrinsic people see their problems as being caused by others, meaning that they can only be solved by others. One manifestation of this extrinsic attitude is a tendency to condemn rather than admire the success of others. I once read something by a French humorist saying that in America, when a pedestrian sees someone ride past in an expensive car, they think, with hard work, that will be me one day. Whereas in France, the pedestrian thinks that capitalist should get down from his car and walk along with the rest of us. Whether or not his joke is or was valid, he was saying the Americans with the American dream have an intrinsic response to inequality. It's me that has to act, work hard to afford such a car, while the French have an extrinsic response. It's the other guy who has to act, get down and walk like me. This could be considered a natural human reaction. In anthropology, there is the famous example of Lee's ox. The anthropologist Richard Lee studied the Bushmen of South Africa, and one Christmas he gave them an ox, which was not something they could afford for themselves. But instead of thanking him, the Bushmen disparaged it, saying, "Call that an ox? It's a scrawny-looking specimen, isn't it? Whoever sold you that must have seen you coming, stuff like that. The point was that Lee's ox was a kind of insult. It was like he was showing off his superiority, making them feel inferior, and that is not a nice feeling. So the Bushmen brought him down to earth by refusing to be impressed. In her introduction to The Gift by Marcel Mauss, the anthropologist Mary Douglas says that she learned from working for a charity that the recipients of charity are not grateful, quite the reverse. They don't like the people who give them charity. It's humiliating to be a recipient of charity. It's a blow to your dignity and self-esteem. So today we may see a billionaire entrepreneur, and instead of admiring his success in transforming the shopping experience, not only for consumers but also for thousands of small businesses, we say, but he exploits his workers, he wastes his money on silly rockets. And so we claw back our self-esteem. Or we may look at Western countries or our own ancestors whose scientific and technological discoveries produced all the abundance of the modern world and say, well, don't think we're impressed with that because you are racist, you are colonialists, and you only did what you did by cheating, by theft, by underhand methods, by slavery. So yes, don't expect us to look up to you, because we don't. That is an extrinsic kind of reaction, but it's not the only possible reaction. 19th century Japan showed the opposite intrinsic attitude to Western industrialization, saying, wow, look at what those people have achieved. Let us study how they did it, and maybe we can do the same or even better. The intrinsic attitude is one of self-belief and confidence in your own agency, not dragging the other party down, not claiming that they have a duty to pull you up, but pulling yourself up by your own efforts. Now, of course, there are injustices in the world and people can have legitimate grievances, so I'm not trying to talk about the rights and wrongs of particular issues. What I am trying to do is define a contrast in the way people respond to the inevitable inequalities and clashes of interest in society, which are contested, fought over and worked out through politics. This contrast between an intrinsic and an extrinsic response is associated with the contrast between what has been called the party of freedom and the party of equality. Intrinsic-oriented people tend to prefer freedom because they believe that if given the opportunity, i.e. if given freedom, they will be able to achieve their goals. And conversely, extrinsic people tend to prefer equality because they believe, consciously or subconsciously, that they will not be able to compete successfully with others and will only get the same as more privileged people if equality is imposed from on high. Now, as I've said, we're not talking about psychology or culture, but about politics, and politics reflects interests. So you can expect the intrinsic style of politics to be favoured by those who are prospering in society, i.e. reaping the rewards of their efforts, while the extrinsic style will tend to be favoured by those who are failing for whatever reason, or by the people who rely on charity. So the extrinsic attitude is associated with a kleptic or redistributive form of politics, where by kleptic I mean taking what others have and redistributing it to those who are lacking. You could call it the Robin Hood approach. So an extrinsic attitude is also likely to favour intrusive government, because governments are inherently kleptic, i.e. extracting value from economic producers by the threat of force and redistributing it to those they choose. The ambiguous certain dimension is about people's willingness to tolerate diversity of opinion. Ambiguity means an acceptance that there is a residual uncertainty about life, and that when people have different opinions about the issues facing society, no one can really say who is definitely right. An attitude of ambiguity holds that we need negotiated solutions to the issues facing us, so that while of course arguing for our own point of view, we listen to the other side of the argument and arrive at an outcome that is reasonably acceptable to all parties, or failing that, we obtain an outcome that reflects some kind of vote, so that the side which is able to persuade the most people wins the argument. Implicit in this sense of ambiguity is an acceptance that your opponents have principled reasons for their beliefs, by which I mean that you accept they are basing their opinions on what they consider to be logic and facts. You may well think that their logic is faulty or their facts are wrong, and you will attempt to persuade them otherwise, but you accept that they are basically well-meaning and just have a different perspective or different interests. So you don't argue about their character and motivations, just about the logic and the facts. A sense of ambiguity also means that you are open to being persuaded by other people's logic and facts if they turn out to be better than yours. So it means you accept that you yourself could be wrong, and you believe it is important to review previous decisions from time to time and perhaps change direction if necessary. Now, certainty is the opposite of all this. It means believing that there is only one correct viewpoint, your viewpoint. And it means believing that those who don't agree with you must be ignorant or unintelligent or deliberately wicked in not accepting what is blindingly obvious. We could refer to the certain attitude as authoritarian, and then the ambiguous attitude might be called laissez-faire or democratic. People who believe in ambiguity are happy to debate the issues, whereas people who believe in certainty see debate as threatening, because debate cannot increase their certainty, which is already 100%, but it might decrease their certainty or decrease the certainty of people who currently think like them. And this means that they prefer to ignore, shut down, imprison, or even execute their opponents to prevent contrary viewpoints from being heard. The certain attitude believes that the end justifies the means. Because such people are certain about what is good and correct, they are ready to believe that whatever is needed to achieve it must be acceptable. It's for the greater good of everybody after all. So they may not like torturing dissidents or stealing elections, but they tell themselves it's okay because it's for a higher purpose, and it would be wrong to let paradise be delayed by a few ignorant or malevolent deniers. We can call this teleodicy, i.e. the belief that the end justifies the means. Teleo means end and disi means justification, from the Greek. The ambiguous attitude is against teleodicy and believes that politics should be fair and reasonable in the here and now, because we don't know what paradise really looks like or where it is. And this ambiguous certain dimension may be another area where the Nazis and the communists, or the fascists and the anti-fascists, are not opposites but the same. Both believe they are absolutely right and their opponents are absolutely wrong and wicked and need to be eliminated before we can build an ideal society. So that is the typology, and now we can do the same thing as Myers-Briggs and give each of the political types a letter. Unfortunately, many of the words begin with the same letter, so the choice of letters is a bit arbitrary, not the initial letter of each word. And here is the summary chart. For individualism, collectivism, we have I and C. For public-private, we have B for public and V for private. For intrinsic, extrinsic, we have N for intrinsic and X for extrinsic. And for ambiguous certain, we have A for ambiguous and T for certain. And so we can describe the 16 political types arising from the various possible combinations of the 4 dimensions by their corresponding letters. And then we can characterize different political movements in terms of where they fit on the chart. For example, I have suggested that communism is collectivist, public, extrinsic, certain, CBXT. But I kind of realise that people will argue about what goes where, and political opponents will accuse each other of having the less desirable attitudes. So this is an outline of a new political vocabulary, one that goes beyond the left-right dichotomy, but it's not a full and final exposition of how to use it. And it's a vocabulary, not a political platform, and certainly not any kind of solution in itself to the problem of how people should live together. And that's it. I'll include in the description a link to a copy of this chart, and I have also written this up as an ebook which is available free of charge, and there is a link in the description for that as well.